Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm 31 years old and I survived the radicalization of online culture. I'm here to explain how the Manosphere developed. People love to blame woke culture for everything from censorship to political violence, but they don't consider that the culture that made woke a household word was built decades earlier by Howard Stern, Opie and Anthony, Patrice O'Neal, Louis C.K., and later Joe Rogan. The anti-PC comedy boom was the original cancel culture, except back then, the goal was mocking anyone who dared take offense. What we're seeing now isn't the invention of political violence by the left, it's the natural evolution of a culture that weaponized humor as power. Howard Stern and Opie and Anthony created a media space where saying the unsayable turned into currency for them. Guests, particularly women, were humiliated, slurs were common, and the thrill was transgression. It wasn't about ideology, it was about dominance. This laid the groundwork for a generation of listeners who saw offense as a form of entertainment and mockery as a form of truth-telling. What felt transgressive during the Howard Stern and Opie and Anthony era was framed as comedy, not politics. The audience laughed because it was taboo, not always because they endorsed it. That distinction eroded online where tone is harder to read. Not everyone who consumed this content was radicalized. Many just grew out of it. Howard, Opie and Anthony, and Joe didn't invent misogyny, racism, or contrarianism. They amplified it in spaces where the point was to entertain, not mobilize. It's also worth noting that biologically, laughter is what people do when they're uncomfortable. And we have interpreted that into comedy as a species. Sometimes their platforms became springboards for bad faith actors, even if they weren't consciously endorsing them. Shock jock culture, YouTube celebrity culture, and eventually podcasting were driven by attention economics. Edgy content keeps eyeballs on screens. This was as much about money and ratings as ideology. Comedians like Patrice O'Neal, Louis C.K., and Mark Maron weren't working in isolation. They were all guests on each other's shows. These overlapping appearances created a tight-knit ecosystem where taboo breaking wasn't tolerated, it was celebrated. The philosophy was simple. Offense proved authenticity. If you could make the room flinch, you had power. This wasn't just comedy, it was social training. Audiences were conditioned to equate transgression with honesty and mockery with truth. Later, Jon Stewart and John Oliver and Stephen Colbert tapped the same currents, channeling that comedic ethos into political satire, blurring humor into a weapon of cultural legitimacy, teaching viewers that mockery was itself a political weapon. It's worth noting who I'm not including in this group, Bill Burr. Even though he was also a regular on many of the shows and best friends with Patrice O'Neal and part of the same scene. The difference is that Burr's comedy, while often abrasive, was rooted in frustration and perspective rather than cruelty as currency. He wasn't chasing shock for its own sake. He would call himself out and the audience, and his career trajectory shows it. Instead of thriving on the offense proves authenticity economy, Burr carved out a lane where honesty and storytelling carried the weight. That distinction matters because it shows not all boundary-pushing comedy was feeding into the same pipeline. That's why he's still relevant and successful, with general approval from all sides. I think he passed that torch on to Theo Von. Going off the same idea that not all boundary-pushing or edgy comedy feeds the same pipeline, Kevin Smith, for example, has been part of the same comedy ecosystem, appearing on Opie and Anthony and interacting with similar peers, but his work emphasizes character, storytelling, and even self-aware humor rather than shock as currency. Similarly, Family Guy or even King of the Hill pushes absurdity and irreverence, but it's structured as scripted satire with punchlines designed to entertain, rather than normalize transgression as social power. Contrast that with South Park, which intentionally blurs the line between satire and ideology, often targeting groups or ideas in ways that subtly reinforce cultural hierarchies or desensitize audiences to cruelty. Recognizing these distinctions is crucial. context, network, and intent matter as much as the joke. If Bill and Kevin represent what you might call the healthy branch of the ecosystem, Joe Rogan shows us how the culture's DNA carried forward into something much more complicated. Rogan straddled both worlds, a product of the same shock jock comedy network, but also the figure who transformed it into a new kind of platform, long-form podcasting, where these ideas could spread even further. Joe Rogan emerged as the bridge, a comedian, a podcaster, the everyman skeptic. He inherited the anti-PC stance, but broadened it with long-form conversations. His show gave space to everyone from comedians to conspiracy theorists, from scientists to culture warriors. By creating a platform where question everything was the mantra, Rogan mainstreamed the anti-PC ethos while normalizing figures who would later shape the Manosphere. I'm not trying to flatten Joe into a villain. He is just a carrier of the culture, like rats carrying the plague. Rogan complicates the story. He's not just a podcaster, he's a comedian, UFC commentator, a martial artist, a TV personality, and someone whose beliefs shift constantly, depending on the guest across the table. Pinning him down ideologically is nearly impossible, and that's exactly why he became such a powerful node in this network. He doesn't preach a single doctrine, he provides the platform where different doctrines collide. In doing so, Rogan extended the same culture Stern and Opie and Anthony cultivated: irreverence, contrarianism, the thrill of pushing back against norms, into a much bigger stage. But unlike his predecessors, he wasn't contained to radio or comedy clubs. His podcast blurred boundaries between entertainment, counterculture, and political discourse, giving the Manosphere and its adjacent movements a place to mainstream themselves without ever seeming like that was the intention. Rogan has had scientists, philosophers, comedians, politicians, and athletes on. He isn't only amplifying the Manosphere or reactionary voices. His openness makes it easy to project whatever narrative you want onto him, and that's why both left and right claim he leans their way. Another honorable mention contributed to this normalization of transgression in more subtle ways. Jimmy Kimmel, for example, co-hosted The Man Show, while also appearing on Win Ben Stein's Money and launching Jimmy Kimmel Live in the early 2000s. Across these projects, Kimmel blended irreverent humor, satire, and celebrity culture, familiarizing audiences with edgy, boundary-pushing comedy without overtly endorsing ideology. The mainstream exposure helped create cultural space where the ethos of shock, mockery, and contrarianism could later flourish in online spaces and the Manosphere. Audiences shape what sticks. For example, PewDiePie leaned on edgy humor because his audience rewarded it, just as the men I'm describing thrived because their listeners loved the boundaries being pushed. Focusing only on the creators erases how much demand fueled the supply. Enter Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, and the modern Manosphere. The DNA is the same. Offense equals truth, dominance equals authenticity, but now it's explicitly political, framed as resistance to feminism, woke culture, and progressive values. What began as entertainment has hardened into ideology. Mockery as power has become hierarchy as destiny. The same transgressive shock-first humor did not stay confined. It traveled into military culture. During the post-9/11 Iraq and Afghanistan wars, soldiers often adopted the same ironic boundary-pushing ethos, dark, cruel humor as a coping mechanism. Jokes about civilians, death, and taboo subjects became a way to assert control in chaotic environments. This wasn't the direct intent of Stern, Opie and Anthony, or their comedy peers, but the ethos of mockery as power was already normalized. Soldiers learned implicitly that humor could be both armor and a tool, a lesson that translated back into civilian online spaces when veterans joined forums, Reddit, and later 4chan poll ecosystems. It's another example of how comedic culture shaped attitudes towards aggression and desensitization long before the Manosphere and alt-right memes fully came to fruition. The word woke originally came from Black activism, meaning awareness of systemic injustice. But white liberals doing what white liberals do best, which is co-opt black people's entire frame of life, it was adopted by mainstream liberalism and mocked by the right, and the meaning was stripped away. Woke became a catch-all insult for anything inconvenient, threatening, or progressive. Its misappropriation shows exactly why blame is misplaced. The same cultural forces that mocked sensitivity in the 90s and 2000s are now mocking justice in a racistly intent way in the 2020s. It's not about woke, it's about who controls the mic. So no, woke culture didn't invent cancel culture or political violence. What we're seeing today is the result of decades of comedy and media training of audiences to mistake cruelty for honesty and mockery for truth. If we want to break the cycle, we have to look past the lazy culture war narratives and recognize the deeper story. The pipeline, from shock jocks to Rogan to Andrew Tate, shows how easily entertainment can harden into ideology. The real question isn't who's woke, it's who benefits when every generation is taught to laugh at justice.